Great. Well, thank you very much. It's good to welcome you back. We're now about to move into a session of exploring issues for the church in the 21st century and in the West. And in a moment, I'll be inviting Stephen Hale to come and give the plenary address for that. But before that, it's as I said yesterday, we've been very well supported by a number of great sponsors, and I think it's been really terrific to have the two major evangelical colleges in Australia sponsoring our conference here today. And right now we're going to hear a little bit about the work of Ridley College here in Melbourne, and we're going to start off with something on the screen, and then I'll invite Brian Rosner, the principal of Ridley, to come and speak to us. So if you'd give your attention to the screen, that would be great.
Hi everyone, as Richard said, I'm Brian Rosner, the principal of Ridley College, and it's my opportunity here to tell you a little bit about the college and to mention three ways in which we might be able to serve you in your own settings. Ridley's been around for just over 100 years. Some of you were at our reception yesterday, so you know our location up in Parkville, right next to the zoo. So sitting in my office of a day, I can hear the apes through the window from the zoo, although sometimes I'm not sure whether it's the students or the apes. But Ridley's got, and we thank God for this, a great evangelical, Reformed and Anglican heritage. Leon Morris, Graham Cole, Peter Adam among my predecessors. A little bit about the college first. Our values are not just to inform students, but to form them in terms of Christ-like character. We're committed to learning in community and training people for all sorts of ministry in different parts of God's world. We're also committed to high academic standards, so the faculty are active in research and writing, and if you have a look at our stall at any point during the conference, you'll see several of our recent books have come out. One I'm particularly excited about, which I'll be talking about tomorrow in my session on disputable matters, is a book that the faculty wrote called Mending a Fractured Church, How to Seek Unity with Integrity. So 5 of the faculty contributed to that. Keep it in mind. So how can we serve you? Well, first up, something for you, the MA Gold. I think the Bible records a long tradition of leaders withdrawing from their contexts and finding some space to pray and study. And it's our view that the MA Gold's a great platform for professional development. The setting for many units isn't too shabby. It's called the Yarra Valley, and it's on the screen there. And don't worry if you're not in Melbourne, we'll pay for your flights from anywhere in Australia. There's also a preaching stream for the MA Gold that tags onto our annual preaching conference in September. This year it's on preaching doctrine with, I'm not sure how to call the conference because it could be the two Peters or for Pete's sake. So Peter Jensen, Peter Adam are coming to help us with the task of preaching doctrine, and Mike Rater and Andrew Reid will be there leading an MA unit on that subject. So that's something for you if you'd like some space for professional development which relates to your ministry context and is of a very high standard. Have a look at the MA Gold brochure which is in your conference pack. The second thing I'd like to tell you about is Ridley Online, something for someone you might know. Ridley College sees the digital revolution as a great opportunity to serve students who can't come to our Parkville campus. So we're investing over 5 years, over $1 million to put the full 1-year graduate diploma and the 3-year degrees online. We've got our own faculty, along with internationally recognised scholars like Craig Blomberg, Darryl Bock, Lynn Coick and others, places like Wheaton and Regent. We've employed an educational designer to make sure that we make the most of that medium of online learning. Now, I know some of you are sitting there wondering whether theological study online is a good idea. My view is that there's great potential, but it has to be done well, hence our full commitment to investing in the online studies. For example, we have the Logos Bible software program that we've got a deal with Logos in America so that all their Bible search tools and most of their textbooks are just one click away. So you could be in Northwest Australia and all of your stuff will be there ready to go for your study. We also have Christian formation units like field education. So the people who are studying online are not isolated on their own, but they've got a mentor in their own setting in a church or in a Christian organisation. We're also doing something with Ridley Online called Learning in Context. And what we have in mind there is partnering with dioceses around the country or with some larger churches or groups of churches who might have people who'd like to dip their toe in the water for theological study. We tailor for them units of study that can be seen online, but then we train the tutors in the context and we actually pay the tutors some of the fees. So talk to someone or to me if you're interested. So something for you, the MA Gold, something for someone you know, Ridley Online, and then something for emerging leaders in your church, the Ridley Certificate. Now, you're all very busy if you're in a church context or in a uni or other context. It's hard to find the time to train those leaders in your context with some extra content that they don't get from Sundays or from small group work. So we have something called the Ridley Certificate. It's entirely online. So imagine if I said to you, we could have Mike Ray to come to your church and teach small groups or one-on-one a 12-week series on Bible survey. Or if we had Andrew Reid come and teach a course on how to read the Bible, or any number of our faculty doing different subjects. It's called the Ridley Certificate. So the Ridley Certificate puts 12 nicely produced videos on a screen. The reading materials are all online. The quizzes are there, and then there are discussion questions and reflection questions to back things up. 12 units make up the certificate. It's just $95 a subject. And if a church wants to, as St Hilary's at Kew have done and other churches, wants to facilitate the certificate in their own setting, make the videos the content, and then to facilitate the discussion, we can strike you a deal. Ridley's been around for 105 years. I've been there just coming up to my 3rd year. And to be honest, I didn't know the college that well. I knew it by reputation. But when I arrived, it was something new to me. So I'm glad to report Ridley is a great place for promoting the gospel. I'm privileged to be involved with a very highly qualified, motivated, godly faculty, a staff that feels called to their tasks and supports the students admirably, and a student body that is serious about theological study, and there's a cheerfulness about our campus life that can only be put down to the fact that we all believe that God is for us in Christ. So if you're interested in partnering with Ridley from your context in one of these 3 ways, the MA Gold, Ridley Online or the Ridley Certificate, our stalls in the foyer, and all the information is in your conference packs. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that, Brian. So we're now going to be exploring the topic encountering critical issues for the church in the West. And Stephen Hale is going to come in a moment to speak, and then the people behind me are not there just as an attractive backdrop to this session. There will actually be a conversation happening with the people behind me a little bit later, and Stephen will be introducing them. If you don't know Stephen, he is a very significant leader here in Melbourne, and we're very blessed to have had him here influencing the life of the church in Melbourne for quite a long time now. Stephen is the lead pastor of the St Hilary's Network and the chair of EFAC Australia. Would you welcome him as he comes to speak to us?
Thank you, Richard. This people behind me are a panel of eminent persons, so they're just to be gazed upon. And they will be making a judgment on my speech at the end. So I'm feeling quite anxious, especially since I have my back to you. But seriously, we have on my right, your left, we have Craig Ogden. And Craig is the team leader of Plenty Life Anglican Church, which has only been going for 5 years. He's also, which is a missional, he describes it as a missional community network. He's also the person who heads up 3DM in Australasia as their team leader, and is involved in Fresh Expressions Australia with the Anglican Church. Next to him is Andrew Katay, who's involved as the rector of Anglican Inner West Parish in Sydney, and he's also the CEO of the City to City in Australia. Next to him is Lynda Johnson. She's at North Pine Anglican. Is that not right? Doesn't really matter. Okay. Well, next to Paul, there is Lynda. And Lynda is at North Pine Anglican Church, where she and her husband Chris have been leading for a very long time. Is it 17 years or something?
You'll find out.
I'll find out, okay. And done a fantastic job in that context. Paul Harrington doesn't need much introduction, but he's the overall leader of the Holy Trinity Network in Adelaide, and has had a significant ministry for a very long time in Adelaide, and a person who's got a great story to tell. And finally, last but not least, is Mark Short, who is the National Director of the Bush Church Aid Society. So when I get to the end of my talk, they will come up unannounced, so perhaps you could welcome them now. Thank you. Well, by any criteria, the past 30 years have seen significant progress in some parts of the Anglican Church of Australia. And I think you could say it's been a very exciting and stimulating and encouraging time. Just reflect on what's happened. The number of evangelical parishes has grown significantly, and many of those parishes have defied the general trends that we've already heard about and have grown numerically significantly. The balance of episcopal appointments has very slowly, and I'd have to emphasise very slowly, started to change in such a way that it now more fully reflects the nature of the reality of who actually attends church in this country. In 1975, there were two large seminaries in Australia, both Moore College and Ridley College, that we've heard about already at this college, and they both continue to be strong. In the West, we've seen the rise of Trinity Theological College, and that's had a significant impact in its context. And as we know, St Mark's College in Canberra has played an important role, particularly in rural dioceses, in training up people in ministry. I'm on the board of Ridley, so I'm biased, but I think Ridley needs particular mentioning because it receives an absolutely minuscule diocesan grant and has done great things, as you've already heard, primarily because of the support of its own foundation and very generous friends. Even in places that generally function as monochrome Catholic dioceses, there are growing numbers of evangelical ministries and growing numbers of evangelical ministers. And there's an encouraging emergence, which is reflected in attendance at this conference, of people who are Orthodox, gospel-hearted Catholic Anglicans, and that's a great encouragement, and it's great to have you with us this time together. Miraculously, through the work of BCA, CMS and the Diocese of North West Australia and the Northern Territory, we have significant ministries in rural parts of Australia where, frankly, if those organisations and groups didn't exist, there probably wouldn't be anything. And I think that's really quite remarkable as part of the story of the Australian Church. Church planting was barely on the radar screen in 1985, but has become a major focus in the past decade in particular. And in this particular city on a hill, which only started 7 years ago, now has 3 campuses, one here, one out in the northern suburbs. Oh, is it the western suburbs? I mean, areas unknown to myself, but somewhere else there on the other side, and in Geelong itself. And they've done a great job in planting. And if you're just hanging around like we are in the city, you can see the number of young people in the city. It's quite remarkable, don't you think? And to have a plant in the heart of the city is, I think, very important and significant. Good quality Bible preaching and teaching is a key feature of many growing churches. And it wasn't the case that 30 years ago that was necessarily the norm, even of evangelical churches. I recall in my own childhood growing up in a church in Sydney where we heard the gospel faithfully every Sunday, but that's all we ever got. Every Sunday we got the gospel every week, and we never got help to grow as disciples. Student ministry has grown both numerically and also extensively. There's been a huge explosion of ethnic-specific ministries due to migration and the influx of refugees. And as I understand it, a third of the people who go to church in the Diocese of Melbourne are in ethnic-specific congregations. Christian welfare agencies offer a very high percentage of Christian welfare delivery in Australia, which is fairly unique to our context. And the Anglican Church is a big player in that area. Alongside of this has been a rediscovery of missions of compassion and justice, which is happening in many churches. And again, that's a relatively new rediscovery and phenomena. Anglican schools have multiplied in recent decades, and committed school heads and staff, as well as chaplains, are in the front line of mission today. For most students that attend these schools, that is the only interface that they and their families have with the Christian church. And it's a very significant interface, and there's large numbers of them. And we should give thanks that the gospel is both being lived out as well as faithfully proclaimed in those contexts. So that's pretty encouraging, don't you think? And there's many other things I could have said in that long list. But at the same time, there are many challenges and one big overall weakness. Sadly, it's true to say that there are many dying churches, and my prediction is that in the next decade, many of those churches that are clinging on will in fact die and will collapse. Radical liberalism, as we know, doesn't reproduce itself, and having been a regional bishop for 8 years, I know what that's like on the inside, because every second Sunday I was in one of those sort of churches, and as much as there was a great endeavour in many of those places to try to find ways to go forward, it was a significant struggle in most of them. According to the 2004 General Synod report on viability and structures, 7 dioceses are currently financially unviable and others are close to that situation. And to quote, "The Anglican Church of Australia is at a crossroads. For over 30 years it has slowly been declining, and the time has come for a revolution if it is to be strong and sustainable church for the future." The sex abuse crisis has radically undermined our standing and credibility. A recent McCrindle research report indicates that this issue is by far the largest reason that people give for not wanting to engage with the church. Parents in our context at St Hilary's, where we've had a significant history of strong and vibrant youth ministry for a very long time, are these days much less willing to send their children to our youth programs, and in fact are suspicious and anxious about their children coming. That's a fairly dramatic shift in a space of a few years. Most dioceses internally operate in a state of semi-perpetual crisis. The tail wags the dog as the small, dying or conflicted churches burn up vast amounts of episcopal and administrative time. Many are under significant financial pressure, and the compliance regimes that we've all been forced to embrace are another reason why many churches will go to the wall, because they simply have not got the capacity to respond to the compliance that is now expected. Too many clergy are being knowingly appointed into small, conflicted and dysfunctional parishes, and the consequences are totally predictable, and many clergy, unfortunately, are paying a very high price for this ongoing activity. Not enough bishops are offering real hope or are actively giving permission to change, with, of course, some outstanding examples across the country. And amongst more conservatively reformed ministers, there is an unhealthy model of high control leadership that leads over time, I think, to significant disengagement by the lay members of the church. At this conference, we are already wrestling with issues in relation to human sexuality. And I don't think I would have said this necessarily in this way if I hadn't have gone back to local church leadership, but pastorally on the ground, it's a major issue. You don't have to scratch too far below the surface of the church that I lead to know that it's a huge cause of grief, as well as tension for many adult members in our church because of the lifestyle choices that their children have made. The very large cohort of young adults we have at our church are growing up in a context where they live themselves with the tension between what the church is teaching and they're seeking to maintain, and yet all of the people that they hang out with and mix with who are living with a totally different view of reality, and that's not easy for them to live that out. They tell me that it's a huge barrier in evangelism, and many people simply will not talk to them when they discover that they're not actively supportive of gay lifestyles. In a wider sense, people who are same-sex attracted have, rightly or wrongly, and whether we like it or not, got the message that they're not welcome in our churches. And I think that's kind of tragic. Well, in the midst of all this, there is, I think, one big overriding weakness or failure, and I can use my own church as an example of that, which is our lack of evangelistic effectiveness. By any criteria, the St Hilary's network of 3 churches is a gifted, capable, educated and articulate group of people. And in fact, as I say, they're probably some of the most capable people that agglomerate anywhere, at any time, in any week in Melbourne. We're a well-resourced church, and they're a church that's been well-taught and had capable ministry up until recent years for a very long time. and it's a very healthy, positive and happy church. It's not a church that's in any way conflicted. It's a great place to be. In most years, we see a number of people converted, mainly Chinese and Iranian people who are associated with our ministries in that area, but very few Anglos. And I guess if anything grieves me more than that grieves me, I guess it's the fact that we don't seem to have as much impact as we'd like to have. And I suspect many people are in a similar position. Well, as we know, mission in Australia is tough. It's estimated that only 30% of the population have any real interest in going to church or having any church connections. A TIER report in the United Kingdom found that 70% of the population had no intention of attending a church service at any point in their lives. The mission-shaped Church of the report of the Church of England put it at 40% who are churched and 40% who are de-churched in an open or closed sense. As Timmis and Chester argue in their Everyday Church, and you'll see the quote on the screen, that means that new styles of worship will not reach them. Alpha and Christianity Explored won't reach them. Toddler churches will not reach them. The vast majority of the unchurched and the de-churched people would not turn to the church, even if faced with a difficult personal circumstances or in the event of a tragedy. It's not a question of improving the product of church meetings and evangelistic events. It means reaching them apart from meetings and events. Many churches are growing, but mainly through transfer growth. And it's still possible to grow a church by offering a better experience than other churches. But this is not evangelistic growth. It's possible to plant a church and see it grow without doing mission. I think that kind of captures the nature of our situation pretty succinctly. So how should we respond to this? Well, my overarching view is that we're living in what I call a crossover era. One way of being church is kind of rapidly starting to die, and many of us have been a part of that way of being and doing church for a long time. And alongside of that, something new is seeking to emerge. Now, I guess the Anglican Church is in a situation where it can just let things as they've always been just gradually die, or it can be involved in allowing something new to emerge as well. There was an era when there was a way of doing church that kind of worked pretty well in most places. And if you've consulted in many churches, they'll tell you about the eras when they had huge Sunday schools and massive youth groups, and church was a very, very busy and successful place. That's a long time ago, but I think deep within our memory banks, we have a kind of an impression that somehow, if we can sort of improve what we do, we can get back to that situation. But I don't think that's likely to happen. The era we are now in is an era of great opportunities if we're seeking to reach out in our day, but at the same time, as we're suggesting, it's an era when it's challenging and the labour is hard and the fruit is seemingly limited at times. At the same time, it's an era of significant tension, both theologically and ecclesiastically, as we're wrestling with at this conference. There are churches and people scattered all over the place as part of our ecclesiastical framework set up for the Christendom era. We go to synods and grind our way through legislation and never-ending motions to convey our good intentions and go home knowing that not much will change as a consequence. And I myself feel like I've spent too much of my life sitting in synods and wonder what the point of it was, frankly. It's an era with seemingly never-ending stream of ideas on the way forward. Just think of the books that have emerged in the past decade or so, and you'll see a little potpourri of them, and they're only a limited selection of books that have come out. For the average minister, it's perplexing, and for the average church board or council or vestry or whatever you call your parish council, it's overwhelming. And I think for many ministers, there's a sense in which if you hitch your wagon to some particular theory that was enunciated in the last 12 months, that something new is going to come along next month, and you'll be blown out of the water because you haven't sort of hitched your wagon to the latest idea, and the ideas just keep coming, and the books just keep coming. Well, what are some of the ways forward? And I want to suggest 8, and this is very much a thumbnail sketch, and then the panel will be opening up some of these issues more fully. Firstly, we need stronger parochial units. In my view, we need less small churches and more churches that have critical mass and energy. There are too many churches in our major cities that are in close proximity and too many that lack the capacity to have the range of ministries that are essential in connecting with and attracting people to be a part of us. If each of those churches is seeking to re-establish themselves, they almost inevitably will be seeking to do very similar things, but totally independently. It would make more sense for these churches to cluster together and to have a team ministry, or for them to each sell up their properties, as has happened, and to co-locate into a larger site with contemporary facilities. In a wider sense, there's a significant shift to larger churches taking place. I think that's more pronounced in Melbourne than it may be in Sydney, but it's certainly a major phenomenon. And if we are to have stronger parochial units, they need to have a clear vision which is owned by the people and an intentional leadership to implement the vision. And in relation to larger churches, the Anglican Church is not necessarily associated with doing large churches. We have a few, but not many. And it would seem we have leadership challenges in terms of growing and sustaining larger churches. So we need better team leadership and ministry. Many of our churches have tired and dated facilities that need significant attention. My mother is in a nursing home in a place in Sydney that shall remain nameless, but the nursing home is directly over the road from the church I grew up and went to as a child. And it's kind of surprising, but the facilities don't look any different to when I left there, when I think I was 21. And that always strikes me as being a bit strange or disappointing. Well, a stronger church will have a comprehensive ministry approach and therefore the opportunity to connect with more people. Leadership of larger churches is both demanding and complex, but it's something I think we need more people who are helped to get to be a part of, because we need to have more of those sorts of churches in the future. But secondly, we need a new lay revolution. Most of our churches are too staff and clergy centred. The bigger you grow, the more staff you had, and if you are in a situation where you are growing, you naturally need to add staff in order to actually grow or to continue to grow. But if you get into the situation where you get a larger team, 10, 20, 30 years down the track, the consequences is a massive disengagement by lay volunteers and lay leadership. People turn up less frequently, they give financially but without any enthusiasm, and they are largely passive because we've pacified them. At St Hilary's we are bigger and more complex than we were 5 years ago, but we have 15% less staff. And whenever possible, we seek to intentionally get lay volunteers to head up ministries because we want to recapture the quality, skill and energy of lay volunteers rather than having staff who are paid to run ministries. We're seeking to rebuild a sense of ownership and participation. Now, we've got a very long way to go on this project, but unlocking the creativity, skill and passion of our volunteers is one of the key leadership challenges of our era. And if you overstaff, then you'll actually kill that initiative and that involvement, and you'll end up in a very unhealthy situation. Our people are the ones who have the relational connections with unbelievers, not often the staff, and they are the ones who are in front line of mission. Our people are time poor, like yours are, but however, that's also true to say that people, if they want to do it, will do it, and they'll give it an amazing amount of time to do it because they're passionate about it, and they've been given the freedom and opportunity to do that. They don't want to be micromanaged, but they want to be trusted, they want to be supported, they want to be encouraged, and they need to be released. Thirdly, localise mission and do it in community. One of the big trends globally is a rediscovery of people living their lives more closely together and seeking to connect intentionally in their neighbourhood. This may be through one of the different models of what are called missional communities. These will be lay-led and run. It's an attempt to rediscover what it means to be a parish by connecting both locally and personally. The gospel is lived out as people share their lives, and as people share their lives and live out their lives, they naturally connect with people who have no church connections, and those relational connections lead to gospel conversations and opportunities. This model can also be used to connect via affinity groups or network groups where you have a shared interest or connection. At St Hilary's we've had a soccer club for the past decade. In the last 2 or 3 years we've had a number of young adults primarily who have decided that we need to turn this soccer club into a missional opportunity. About 50% of the players in the club are church members and Christians, and 50% aren't. And for the past year, we've had a missional community operating in relation to the soccer club, and happily, as a result of that, we've had several people become Christians in the past year. This model is also applicable in the workplace as people meet to pray and connect with their work colleagues. They support each other to be salt and light, but they also help each other to connect and to help people to come to things as well as to share the gospel with people so they can hear about Christ. Fourthly, planting and replanting. As one form of being church gradually dies, many facilities will become available as a base for plants, replants and networks. As I understand it, the only city in the Western world where church attendance has actually increased is London. And that's partially because of the explosion of ethnic churches, but it's also because of a permission-giving bishop who actually has initiated plants and replants out of Anglican churches in the City of London, north of the river. Our major cities and provincial cities are growing rapidly, and the population in our cities and inner cities is rapidly increasing. The population in the CBD of Melbourne was 2,100 in 1993. In 2013, it was 116,000 people, and it's projected to be 163,000 people by 2020. A rapid shift of people moving and living in the CBD, which is why church plants in the city are incredibly important. In broad terms, we are too often raising up leaders to be trained for a settled church, where we do actually need to be training up people to be missionary pioneers, to either re-establish the church or to start a church. Our theological colleges need to develop alternate pathways to ministry with in-context learning alongside of the more regular Bible and theological studies, so that people are trained in teams to be a part of plants or replants. At the same time, the growth corridors keep extending, and we have struggled to keep up with the church plants needed in these particularly challenging, expanding suburbs and also the provincial cities. Fifthly, ethnic churches. Clearly, the growth in this area is a major cause for rejoicing, and God is literally bringing the world to us, and we rejoice at the opportunities that is creating. It's true to say that the people who are most likely to be receptive to the gospel aren't Anglos, but people who come to us and are recent arrivals, and they simply pour into our situations where they can hear about the gospel, and we need to be making as much of that as possible. It's great that Sydney Diocese is reflecting this in its episcopal appointments, and that's a great encouragement and, I think, example to the rest of the Australian Church. Sixthly, permission-giving bishops. There's much that one could say about bishops, but what we most need are permission-giving bishops who are supportive and willing to go out on a limb for the sake of those who are taking risks. The bishop has a key pastoral role, but also a key role as a broker and advocate. There are still bishops who play a heavy hand in blocking appointments and not allowing the best people to be appointed. And it seems kind of farcical that in 2015 we're still in this situation, where the good growth of the church that people claim that they're committed to, they're actually stifling and not allowing to happen. As the General Synod report said, the diocese must make serving the frontline parishes in mission its key priority rather than the other way around. Seventh, and I'm almost at the end, allow people to have the best training available. Australia is uniquely blessed with two of the strongest Anglican theological colleges in the world, and bishops who are mission-minded will want their clergy to be formed at the best colleges. Any other organisation would want its people to have the best possible training, and those options exist in our country, and we need to get to a point where people are allowed to have the training at the best colleges rather than at other options which aren't as optimal. Finally and lastly, riding the boomer wave. The largest cohort in the population is moving to retirement. That's the boomers. They're gifted, they're experienced, and in many cases they're cashed up, and they want to be a part of something significant as they move into this new phase of their lives. And as we all know, they're going to be living longer and longer. You'll notice I'm talking about this in third person because I am in total denial about the reality that I'm a part of this age group. And I also minister in a church where we have no old people, because no one at our church relates to being an old person. If you use that, they all go, that's not me. So it's kind of interesting. So this is a remarkable opportunity which we need to be geared up to and embrace now. And if we don't embrace it now, then an incredible opportunity will pass and we'll have missed out. These people don't cost anything to employ, which is a great advantage. They are incredibly capable people. They do want to make a contribution. They don't want to be micromanaged, and they want to be given some trust and freedom to actually do exciting new things. So I think it's a great opportunity which we need to be giving creative consideration to and actively embracing. Well, that's enough from me, so let's hear from our 5 panel members who each have 10 minutes. I have no idea how we're going with the time, but we did start 15 minutes late, so I'm taking that into consideration. Thank you. So we'll start off with Craig Ogden, who's going to be talking about new missional movements. So let's welcome Craig.
Could save us a lot of time and just say amen and sit down at this point. Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real privilege to be here today and to be able to share with you about a movement that is having a profound impact on the church in the Western world. It's a movement that Stephen's already touched on called missional discipleship. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard that term before, but if you have not, you might have heard some of the ways this movement is actually being expressed at the present time. We've already heard about missional communities. How many of you have heard of Soma communities? Quite a number. How about huddles, life transformation groups, learning communities? Okay, quite a few of you. So these are all organisational realities that are expressions of the missional discipleship movement. And behind them are a number of groups who seek to coach and equip key leaders in its principles and practices. So I'll be really interested to know if you've heard of some of these. 3DM, yeah, Missio, Verge, New Thing, Soma Schools, the GMC Collective. There's a lot of Googling that'll be happening after this session today, I think. All this is to say that this movement is in full swing and it's having a massive impact in the UK, in the US and in Europe, and it's now really in development here in Australia as well. But where did it come from? What were its origins? Well, effectively, it can be traced back to conversations like we're having today, when the church in the UK realised early in the 1990s that it was facing a real crisis with declining numbers and a rise in secularism. And this culminated in the Mission-Shaped Church report that was the catalyst for Fresh Expressions, an initiative of both Archbishops of Canterbury and York and the Methodist Council back in 2005. This was, and it still is, an attempt to reimagine church for the unchurched, and has been very successful, particularly in the UK, but there are some fantastic examples of fresh expression churches here in Australia as well. Fresh Expressions had as its genius that it allowed for both a gathered and a scattered modality for the gathering of God's people, which was a helpful and necessary corrective to that reactionism of the emerging church movement. It expressed a great commitment to the scriptures, to the creeds, and to the traditions of the church as well as contextualised engagement in God's mission. This engagement wasn't based so much on our plans and capacity as people, but in God's missionary work as a Missio Dei. The key question became one of, where is God already at work in the local community, and how can we together get on board with it? These principles of missional engagement through the leading and power of the Spirit and joining together in both gathered and scattered modalities underpin the missional discipleship movement of today. One of its key leaders, Hugh Holter from Missio, listed some of the core tenets in a recent blog post, and he lists the following. He says that they all agree, all these various streams in the missional discipleship movement, they all agree that the best way to start a church or renovate a church is through the proliferation and multiplication of intentional missional communities. That missional communities must be the primary organising structure that holds together and propel a church forward, not just that weekend service. That leaders must model the way first and then invite others into their experience where they can be apprenticed. That missional only works if it's accompanied by incarnational nuances. Now, in other words, programmatic methods must be replaced by personal ownership and commitment to live in the world like Jesus. That leaders must be equippers of ministry, not just paid to do the ministry for a consumer culture that sets up that client-provider relationship. That church gathered should be lean, nimble, far less expensive and thus more free to stay on mission. They have a term of keeping things lightweight and low maintenance. They strive for simple church so it can be flexible and responsive to where God would lead it. The discipleship practices must be active and not passive, and in community, not individual. Integrated with a family, not isolated or compartmentalised away from the family. So the way that has looked for me and my family is we spent some time with the kids over dinner one night actually discussing why has God brought us into being as a family? What might his purpose be for us? And so we workshopped that, we worked it on through and felt that vision statement that reflected what we sensed God was saying to us was to enjoy God's gift of life and to share it with others. Now our kids are actually mindful of that in the engagement with their friends and within our neighbourhood as well. The family unit is taken into great consideration within the missional discipleship movement. And then this last one here, that the gospel is both a verbal witness and an active witness. And it's most visible, some have described this as a tangible kingdom, most visible as a community lives intentionally between worship, community and mission, or of up, out and in. Those three dimensions of relationship that Jesus had as a priority in his own life. Now it's important to note that these principles of values are expected to be fleshed out contextually. As a movement, there's a strong emphasis on low control with high accountability, in which people are encouraged to discern and follow what they believe God is saying to them, not just what the leader might be telling them. Now, where did I first hear about this? Well, I heard about it, believe it or not, at a post-ordination training day. Who would have thought? That was 6 years ago. And looking back on it, I see it as God's provision for me at a time when I was looking at planting this new church in the Plenty Growth Corridor to the north of Melbourne, a church known as Plenty Life, as a network of now 6 missional communities. And at the time, all I had was this deep sense that God was wanting to bring into being a church that was organically connected to the local community, not this little pocket of Christendom. And significantly, I'd also been encouraged by the diocese here in Melbourne to do something different, to experiment with a fresh expression of church, one that would more readily connect with the many unchurched people in the area of Myrna and Doreen. And I just want to say at this point, reiterate what Stephen has said, that permission giving is so important around experimentation, the encouragement to try new things for our new leaders in pursuing the work of the kingdom. It's one of the greatest gifts that we can give to new leaders, to foster a pioneering spirit amongst those who have a vision for what else could be, even if we can't see it for ourselves. It's critical for reimagining church in a landscape vastly different from what we have known before. So you see, I had all this desire, all the vision and all the permission giving really, to develop a church that was fully engaged with the local community. But you know what? To be honest, I had no way of knowing how to make that happen. I didn't know how to bring that into reality. And you know, I think this is often the case. We sense where we need to go, we can glimpse that greater reality, but we're just not sure how to get there. As a result, we can feel a bit helpless, at a loss as to what to do. But you know, one of the greatest emphases of our Anglican heritage, I think, is that we are encouraged to look out from ourselves. We're actually encouraged in this, to not just look to the past, but to be intentional about engaging with the present and to look even beyond our own tribe. J.I. Packer identifies this in his foreword to the Accidental Anglican, describing Anglicanism as being determined to preserve and practice the faith in its fullness, and to that end, learn all that can be learned from the Christian past, the creeds and theologians, and also from what goes on in the Christian present, within and outside the Anglican fellowship. Sitting in that post-ordination workshop, which, to be completely honest, I had no real anticipation would be a conduit for inspiration. Nevertheless, I heard about St Thomas's Anglican Church in the UK, in Sheffield, and 2 things struck me. And the first was, here's a church very similar, with a very similar culture to our own around it, a culture that was highly secular, individualistic, post-Christian and consumerist, and yet it had become one of the largest churches in Europe and one of the fastest growing. So from that point on, I read all I could. But just as it is with discipleship, there are some things you just can't learn from a book. So I had to head on over there, see it for myself, and that's what I did. I spent time interviewing the staff, got to see firsthand a disciple making movement that was transforming church members into local missionaries. Where in communities of anywhere from 15 to 50, they were doing life together in worship, gathering around God's word, sharing meals and creating safe places for the unchurched to serve with them in making a difference to others. In short, they were creating places of belonging and purpose in a community that was both large enough to dare and to do something significant in mission, and small enough to care, where everyone felt known and loved. these communities are one of the key features of the missional discipleship movement. But what gives these communities a real strength isn't their size, where they meet, their logistics, but the fact that within them there's an intentional discipling dynamic. These aren't just missional communities, they're discipling communities. And as such, they're a response to one of the critical issues facing the church today, which is ineffectiveness in disciple making. The leader of 3DM, Mike Breen, says one of the buzzwords around today is the word missional. Don't we know that? People want to create missional churches or missional programs or missional small groups. The problem is we don't have a missional problem or a leadership problem in the Western church. We have a discipleship problem. If you know how to disciple people well, you'll always get mission. Always. You see, somewhere along the way, we started separating being missional from being a disciple, as if somehow the two could be separated. You know, this is the real contribution of the missional discipleship movement. It encourages the church to rediscover discipleship as learning how to live out the missional life of Jesus and of following his methodology of making disciples. So it's about life on life in the context of community. We see that Jesus took a community with him into the Father's mission, and he did discipleship along the way. That it was a whole of life thing, not just a few hours on a Sunday. There was a rhythm between the temple and the home of formal public worship and less formal, gather around family, friends and neighbours. We see him engaging the crowds, but investing in the few. We see that for Jesus, discipleship wasn't about a program, but it was an apprenticeship, where over time his disciples would come to know not just about him, but learn to do the things that he did. For me, this has changed the whole way I view my relationships. Mike over the back fence is one of my neighbours who won't ever set foot in a church. He's one of that 70 to 75% of Australians who will never go to a church service because it's just too culturally alien. But you know what he does love to do? He loves to get behind a barbecue. And he's one of the 95% of guys who do. I mean, that's my estimation. I don't know, I'm a crindle, I'm not sure. But here's the thing. We spend time together at barbecues over at my house and at his place. And when my missional community runs a barbecue for the local school at the commencement picnic, I ask him, hey, Mike, would you mind helping us out on Friday? We're running a barbecue to help out Hazel Glen College. Now, he won't come to a service, but he was there doing outreach with us twice last year. It was a safe place for him to connect, to belong and to find a purpose with others of God's people. It was a safe place. At the beginning of this year, we had an informal gathering with the whole church at the park with the barbecue, and guess who was there setting it up? Getting there early enough to even put up a tarp around it to stop the wind from getting on through. It was Mike, and he brought other members of his family. Here's the thing. Every time he does life with us, he sees a little more of who Jesus is. My prayer is that ultimately he'll one day come to see who Jesus really is and come to faith in all its fullness. You see, it takes time, intentionality, and commitment to engage with others in a real way. And this is what missional discipleship is all about. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Craig. That was fantastic. Andrew. Shuffle along with you.
Well, I'm honoured to be part of this potpourri of thoughts and ideas. I'm going to talk to you about church planting briefly, and I wonder when you hear the words church planting if your gut response varies somewhere between skinny jeans and chai lattes on the one hand, or penicillin and a cure for cancer on the other. Is church planting just a phase that hopefully will be soon through, like other phases that periodically come and go in church life, or is it the answer to everything? The solution to all problems and the only gateway to a glorious future? And as CEO of City to City Australia, I lead a church planting organisation, and so naturally enough, I'm here to tell you it's actually neither. It's not a mere trend or fad, for the obvious reason that one another life, and therefore church, is central to God's purposes for his people. Even a skim reading of Ephesians will tell you that. And every church that exists has a beginning, which, if you like agricultural metaphors, you could call church planting. At the same time, church planting comes in many forms, from independent churches to congregation plants and everything in between, green fields and brown fields, and has many specific risks and advantages, and is only a part of what God is doing in and through his people. So I want to very briefly unpack the challenge of church planting in an Anglican context under 3 headings. Firstly, its normality. Second, its net results. And then thirdly, how to nurture it. So firstly, its normality. The first thing I want to do in relation to church planting is to normalise it for us. Church planting is built into the fabric of Anglican missiology. The geographic nature of our understanding of mission, also known as the parish system, commits us to church planting. It comes out of a biblical conviction that because all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to Jesus, so he sends us to all nations, all peoples in the hard-to-reach areas as well as the easy ones, to the Bible boot-sole suburbs as well as the Bible belt-buckle suburbs in poor and migrant majority suburbs as well as lily-white Anglo suburbs, and to make disciples of all of them. And so we divide the world up into dioceses, and we appoint a mission director for all of those dioceses, also known as a bishop, an overseer of the mission in that diocese, and then those bishops get some help and start carving up their dioceses into parishes and appointing vicars or rectors. And they get about the business of making disciples, that is, baptising converts and gathering them to be taught everything by Jesus, and that necessarily means planting churches. And if you know your diocesan history as well, then you'll know that many of the great Episcopal leaders have been ferocious church planters. For example, since we're in Melbourne, you may know that Charles Perry oversaw the building of 162 churches in 20 years, between 1850 and 1870, on average 80 a year. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking it was easier then than now. But you don't know what it was like in 1850 if you think it was easier then than now. I say this because sometimes the notion of church planting evokes in us fear and turf protection, and the parish system is seen as an enemy of church planting. And what I want to suggest to you is it's actually the opposite, that planting is part of our DNA. Missionally, we are a church planting denomination. We've been doing it for centuries. There's no reason to think that just because we have one church for every 10 or 20,000 people in the country, we've somehow reached a terminus. Which leads to a second point. What is the net result of the recent church planting movement? Well, the anecdotes are mixed. Some report that church plants are simply sheep swapping, or worse, sheep stealing, illegitimate transfer growth. However, while the anecdotes are mixed, the research is in. The 2011 National Church Life Survey results compared church plants with existing churches and whether they differed in terms of health and viability. And if we can have the next slide, because you might want to look at this for a little bit. The unequivocal answer is yes, there's a difference, because on every core quality used in the National Church Life Survey, church plants were statistically significantly ahead of existing churches, and especially on what National Church Life Survey Director Ruth Powell calls the heavy hitters: shared vision, empowering leadership, and faith sharing, which drive the other qualities. Church plants are way ahead. And so unsurprisingly, church plants have slightly more than twice as many of their members, 17%, as compared with 8%, who were previously either unchurched or dechurched for at least 5 years. In other words, just suppose you were interested in reaching new people with the gospel of Jesus Christ and seeing them repent and grow in much faith, you'll be into church planting. But the anecdotes also reflect real experience, and so it leads to a third point: how do we nurture fruitful church planting rather than just sheep-stealing church planting? Perhaps it was good enough for the British Empire to send young men to an Oxbridge education, give them a couple of years in the public service, and then pack them off to run the empire in India or something. But that's a disaster for church planting. It didn't do much good for the empire in the end either. To nurture fruitful church planting requires a well-designed and executed church planting pipeline and context. Such a pipeline includes proper assessment, task-specific training, ministry coaching, and adequate funding. And I'd suggest that this is absolutely worth deep diocesan investment. In fact, it may actually do more harm than good to go off half-baked without these elements of the pipeline. And the reason is that the people who are most damaged by failed church plants are not typically the planters. They bounce back, they move on to their next ministry opportunity and carry on. No, the people who most feel it are the lay people who prayed their hearts out and invested massively in time and energy and money and dared to hope and dream and are often enough left confused and bereft and even drift away disillusioned. In other words, it's worth it to make sure that church plants have the very, very best opportunity to take root and thrive and bear much fruit for the Lord's glory. Well, let me suggest then 3 points of application for an Anglican church planting future. First, can we please embrace the principle that a rising tide lifts all boats? Welcome church plants in your area, whether they're new independent churches or another denomination or even slightly rogue Anglican. Or at least if you don't welcome them, search your heart before the Lord and make sure it's not just junky turf protection. One of the things that first attracted me to the ministry of Tim Keller was hearing firsthand about Redeemer Presbyterian Church pouring tens of thousands of dollars into an Episcopal church plant. Have you ever heard of such a thing? Why? Why would anyone do that instead of complain about them? It's because he recognised that you need more than one church and more than one kind of church to reach an area. Second, I'd suggest that there are substantial things to learn from the church planting movement. In particular, I'd highlight the need for biblically rich, missiologically insightful contextualisation. Yeah. Do you want me to say that quickly 5 times? No. Church plants typically take very, very seriously the whole range of decisions they make about service style and power sharing in the congregation and community connectedness, and especially the way they speak the gospel to people. Not what their itching ears want to hear, but rather, as Keller defines it, the Bible's answers, which they may or may not at all want to hear, to questions about life that people in their particular time and place are asking, in language and thought forms that they can comprehend, and through appeals and arguments with force they can feel even if they reject them. And if I had another hour or so, I'd unpack that. But I'd suggest to you it's no accident that twice as many of their number are previously unchurched or de-churched people. Exactly who we are sent to reach. We could do well to learn from the church planting movement about contextualisation. And thirdly, to embrace the possibility of church planting in classic Anglican form, mother-daughter and congregational planting. I believe that this kind of church planting has some real advantages in terms of sustainability, a support scaffold and missional flexibility. And frankly, it's here that Episcopal governance can be a real advantage to help ensure that it happens in a coordinated rather than a chaotic fashion. And if only a quarter of Anglican churches took up the challenge of congregational or mother-daughter planting with genuine kingdom-minded backing and within a thought-through and well-resourced planting pipeline, I wonder what God might do through us. I was encouraged to let you know that City Australia stands ready to assist in this. We have all the elements of the pipeline either in place or emerging in most of the capital cities of this country: assessment, church planning specific training, coaching and funding. And so if you'd like to explore your potential in church planting, either as a church planter yourself or as a rector or vicar overseeing a plant, then please feel free to be in touch.
Earlier this week, Monica and I were in the audience for the When the Bush Comes to Town edition of Q&A. And as we walked into the venue, we passed a couple of bemused-looking alpacas in this tiny little enclosure. And on the stage behind the speakers, there was a row of Hale bales. And before the broadcast, we were warmed up by a bloke with a guitar singing 80s rock covers with a generic country twang. Clearly, the producers had made certain assumptions about what life in the bush is really all about. But you know, when it comes to mission, sometimes it's our unspoken and our untested assumptions that are actually the most misleading. When the organisers kindly invited me to share in this session, I was given the title, The Future of Rural Ministry. I asked if I could change it to Rural Ministry and the Future of Mission. The change is subtle, but it's significant. We often assume, don't we, that the bush is sheltered, at least for a time, from those great changes that are sweeping through the rest of Western culture. It can even be comforting to imagine that somewhere over the ranges there is a place where life is simpler, perhaps even more Christian. If we want to understand the challenges facing the church in the West, we are told we need to look at our cities, because as goes the city, so goes the culture. Well, this afternoon, I want to turn those assumptions on their head for two reasons. Firstly, in an era of rapid and pervasive globalisation, there really are no backwaters. The modern farmer who watches the weather on the Bureau of Meteorology website, who makes marketing decisions based on movements in the Chicago futures market, who downloads GPS data before sowing, is under no illusion that globalisation somehow stops at the farm gate. And secondly, there is what you might call the localised diversity of the bush. The Australian bush is every bit as diverse as our major capital cities, but the different aspects of that diversity are concentrated in particular geographical locations. Let me unpack that second point by describing to you 5 different types of communities we engage at BCA, and how each one of them highlights a pressing missional challenge that faces all of us. If I were to ask you what are the main features of our big cities, I'd reckon you come up with a list that includes some of the trends highlighted by Claire yesterday. Mobility, cultural diversity, a young age profile, the blurring and the reconfiguration of the boundaries between home and work. I've chosen the label fluidity to summarise those trends. Everything and everyone seems to be on the move. Then let me tell you about one type of community that is even more fluid than our big cities. It's not unusual for a BCA minister in one of our mining towns to farewell half of their congregation each year. And that congregation will be young and culturally diverse. When I visited our church at Newman in Western Australia, in a congregation of some 60 people, there were 20 different nationalities represented. And members of that congregation were engaged in a variety of different working arrangements. Many of them were fly-in, fly-out workers, working for up to 2 weeks at a time in Newman before travelling home to spend time with their families. And there's also the emerging phenomenon of reverse FIFO, where people, as it were, set up home in the mining town only to travel back occasionally to the city where their family and children live. Our Anglican parish structures developed in a settled world, where people were often born, lived, nurtured and died within a few square kilometres around which we placed discrete parish boundaries. But that is not our world any longer, and it is certainly not the world of our brothers and sisters in mining towns. We have much to learn from them as they are compelled by the love of Christ to adopt a generous kingdom perspective, where ministry is not about investing in people so that our church may grow. Ministry is about investing in people so God's kingdom will grow wherever life takes them. Our next type of community. For many of our farming communities, the challenges are different. Their populations are older and less mobile. Declining terms of trade and increases in productivity mean that many of them are experiencing declines in population, as young adults in particular have to move to our big cities for education or for work. Here the great challenge is to both tend our inherited structures of ministry and mission, but also to develop new expressions that will engage those who are not yet Christian. You could call it the challenge of faithful innovation, recognising the good in the old so that it becomes the springboard for the best of the new. And by God's grace, we have begun to see this happen in some of our BCA locations, both through the renewal of existing ministries and through the establishment of new ones. Of course, this is a challenge for many of us regardless of where we live. And once again, we have much to learn with and from each other. Thirdly, regional communities and the challenge of networking for growth. Larger regional centres like Ballarat or Bendigo in Victoria, Wagga Wagga and Tamworth in New South Wales, Toowoomba in Queensland, Mount Gambier in South Australia and Geraldton in Western Australia are often called sponge communities because they have a tendency to soak up people and resources from the districts around them. They become the places where people must go for healthcare, to shop, to go to school, to engage with banks and with government departments. The great challenge for ministry and mission in these regional centres is actually to squeeze that sponge so that some of the resources and maybe even some of the people begin to flow outwards again. What might this look like in practice? Well, it might look like a church in a regional city becoming a hub for the training and support of Christians in outlying towns. It might look like a regional university campus becoming a centre where young Christians are evangelised, discipled, given a vision for mission and ministry beyond graduation as life takes them back to the bush, as we're beginning to see in our BCA-supported ministry in Launceston. It might look like Christians who are dispersed across a wide area, engaging in learning and fellowship through online technology. In a world where people wish to connect through networks rather than serve under rigid hierarchies, we all have much to learn with and from the bush. And next we have our lifestyle communities and the challenge of skepticism. As we've already been reminded this week, we live in an era of increased skepticism and even hostility towards the Christian gospel. But we often assume that the bush is somehow immune from those trends, as if closeness to the creation gives people a head start in knowing their creator. Now, someone had to be the bloke who showed the picture of rainbow scarves at an Anglican Futures conference. But the reality is that many rural communities, and particularly those with a high lifestyle component, like Dalesford in Victoria or Byron Bay in New South Wales, Mullaney in Queensland, Kangaroo Island in South Australia, Denmark in Western Australia, have a level of skepticism that matches inner city Sydney or Melbourne. And you encounter the same mixture of aggressive secularism and diffuse spirituality that you'd see in Brunswick. At BCA, we are still learning, to engage these communities through friendship and through clear, creative and courageous gospel proclamation. And once again, there is much we can learn from each other. And finally, Indigenous communities and the challenge of partnership. I find it not so much amusing, but puzzling that people often imagine that issues of justice for our Indigenous brothers and sisters are a uniquely rural issue, as if the land on which we meet here isn't also colonised, stolen and invaded. Having said that, ministry in Indigenous communities in the bush does or should force us to engage with issues of genuine partnership. How can we create sustainable pathways into leadership for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Christians, recognising that just as their context for ministry is different to ours, so will those pathways need to be different? How can we move beyond paternalism into a genuine partnership where the norm is not ministry to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but ministry with and ministry by? How can we engage the mixed record of our church in this area in a way that both acknowledges the past in all its complexity as well as doing justice in the present? Surely these are vital challenges for all of us. At BCA, we are beginning to learn what God is asking of us in response as we seek both to support the current generation of Indigenous Christian leaders and to partner in raising the new one. We would love you to learn with us as we learn from them. Well, finally, you may have noticed in this presentation that I've asked many questions and given few answers. Later this afternoon, Bishop Rick Lewis and I will be leading a workshop on thriving in rural ministry, where we'll begin to explore how we can faithfully respond to some of these challenges. But for now, I just want us to sit with the challenges and the questions, because it's from here that I believe we have the best opportunity to grow our partnership in gospel ministry. Now, I would love to see a network develop around each one of those questions. A network that crosses cultural and diocesan boundaries. A network that unites the city and the bush in mutual learning and fellowship for the sake of faithful and creative mission to our nation as a whole. If you visit the BCA stall after this talk or throughout the rest of our gathering, you can pick up a copy of this presentation and also a form on which you can express your interest in being part of one of those challenge-based networks. We'd also love to talk with you about what it's like to serve on the ground in the bush. There are great and wonderful opportunities out there. Of course, the real challenges facing the church in the West are not organisational or technological, and neither are the faithful responses. The key issue, as always, is profoundly theological. As we face an uncertain future, will we drive our foundations deep into the bedrock of God's gracious sovereignty, revealed in the death, the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ? The goodness, the power and the wisdom of God are to be seen precisely where our world least expects to meet them. In a man condemned to death on a cross. Then as now, God delights to turn our assumptions on their heads.
I was just asking Stephen about the fact that I'm cutting into coffee time and whether we needed to reschedule, but we'll continue going. But if you start to get the shakes and feel desperately needy, I won't be offended. I'm Paul Harrington. I've been the Senior Minister at Holy Trinity Adelaide since 1993. I actually started on the staff team there in 1988. And in fact, when I became a Christian in 1978 as an undergraduate at Adelaide University, friends took me to Trinity at that time. Now, I tell you this to let you know I have one church experience in my life. That's it. And it's just as well to be advised about that. I'm also aware that there are two delegates here today who are actually on the staff team at Trinity when I went there in 1978, people who discipled me and who were enormously patient with me as well, and I thank them for their patience. Stephen has asked me to talk a little bit about the way in which Holy Trinity has gone from being a church, a CBD church, a reasonably large one, to being part of a network of churches and how we've made that sort of transition. Let me give you the context. Adelaide, in Anglican terms, is a liberal diocese. There are around 65 to 70 parishes. 7 of those are evangelical, and almost all of those, I think, are represented here at this conference. There's a real collegiality among those 7, and around 40 to 50% of the attending Anglicans in Adelaide attend those 7 churches. So it just gives you a sense of the scope in Adelaide. Holy Trinity was established in 1836. And if you have any understanding of the colony, that's when the colony was established. So it's a very old church, very sandstone, and it has not had a strong history, but it flourished after World War II. So in the 1960s, it began to grow. In the 70s and 80s, it basically reached capacity in terms of the holding level of the church facilities located in the downtown area. And so by the time I became senior pastor in 1993, the challenge was to think, what will we do? That is, we're sort of full. There was a sense in which the evangelistic edge, I think it diminished because the buildings were largely full. And so the question was, where to from here? Should we build bigger buildings or should we think about church planting? One of the challenges with church planting was we'd never done it before and had no idea what to do. And there weren't very many people at that stage around us who'd had much experience in doing it. So it was that sort of journey. We spent 5 years thinking through the issue of where we were going. We prayed, we discussed, we planned, and I participated in many denominational meetings and task force and committees. That was the process. At the end of that period, we decided that what we'd love to do is to be a part of a movement where Adelaide and South Australia were saturated with the gospel. We thought that that could best happen by planting lots of new churches and partnering with other people doing that same sort of activity, and to do it in a networked way. That is, the denomination was relatively weak, and we were concerned that any churches that were planted would be part of a network and have a level of accountability and support and strength into the second generation. That was our thinking. We started in 2001. Our idea, given that we were a city church with a regional pull, was to plant on a 20-minute driving perimeter around our church in the hope that those churches would then be able to plant beyond that perimeter. And that way we might see the gospel continue to go out. We rented facilities. We didn't want to invest in property that would slow up that planting activity. And we sent, for those church plants, a minimum of 50 people, because from what I could read and see and observe, getting beyond that 50 mark would help a more rapid evangelistic sort of growth. And we were able to think about doing that because the church, the mother church, was about 800 to 900 people. So it was a reasonably large church and able to take that step. In 2001, we planted our first church 25 minutes from where the mother church was, basically on the road from Adelaide to Melbourne, sort of a satellite suburb. We sent somewhere between 60 and 90 people, just depending on whether you talk to the church planter or me. And but that's the nature of planting. And that's right. The planter is here today. That's right. So feel free to talk to him. And we saw that grow to around 250 people over the following 5 years. In 2006, we planted to the southwest of the city, about 25 minutes. We sent 50 people, and that grew to about 180 over a 5-year period. In 2010, the daughter church we planted a granddaughter church further along the freeway to Melbourne. We'll eventually get here, you know. It's again, a regional spot. Sent about 50, that's grown to about 200 since 2010. A week apart from that plant, we planted to the northeast of the city, sent about 70 or 80. That has grown to about 200 people at this stage with plans to plant. Then in 2013, we planted 15 minutes directly to the south of the city. We sent our largest group, 110. That was more than we wanted to send it from one perspective, but we sent that number because we lost a cinema next door to our church that we were using for our main family service. We were overcrowding the city site, and in order to keep growing, we needed to send more people out to create space. But it did hurt sending that number of people. But that church has now, 2 years later, grown to 260 to 280 and is flourishing. All these churches have grown evangelistically. There's been minimal transfer growth. It's been de-churched people and unchurched people, and the de-churched have been de-churched for a significant period of time. Most of that, I think, is actually conversion growth in a fairly clear sense. Sunday week, God willing, we're planting or having a public launch for a great-granddaughter church. So the church that got planted is now planting. That's an hour and a half to the south of the city in a place called Victor Harbour. So certainly I'd love you to be praying about that. We're very thankful for what's happened. But can I say, as a senior pastor, I found it's felt incredibly slow. And we're really keen that in the next 10 years we might see accelerated planting happening, and that we might see twice as many churches planted as we've seen in the last decade. We're concerned for the rapid spread of the Word of God, and it's felt like it's spread, but it'd be great to see it steeple up over the next little while. Let me just conclude with a couple of thoughts so I can then release you for your caffeine fixes. Here, 4 thoughts. What we've tried to focus on as a network is God's grace and His glory. Our mindset has been not what we do for God, but what He has done for us, and therefore a deep passion to take that gospel to other people. And we've kept that front and centre. We don't celebrate what we've done, we celebrate what God is doing. And we want that to be our focus. This is the second comment, Anglican Future Conference. Therefore, I want to make a couple of denominational comments. After the last 15 years, I'm extraordinarily aware of the natural inertia of the denomination. Those of you who were here at the opening session yesterday, Archbishop Freer was talking about the nature of gospel ministry here in Australia, and he talked in part about good order, and I'm all for good order, but often I think good order has, in my experience and my location, meant structures, theology and leadership that have obstructed gospel growth. I know that's not genuine good order, but that has been the way in which it has unfolded. Sunday week when we plant a church, it'll be the second time we've planted across a diocesan boundary. Now, that obviously needs to be dealt with in a helpful sort of way. And we've always discussed all our planning activities with the leadership of the denomination. But it seems to take an enormously long time to get through the reality of an arbitrary dotted line on a map. That is, it's incredibly obstructive of gospel ministry in my experience. We need to positively discriminate in favour of evangelistic activity and planting activity. It's incumbent upon us to do it at this point in our history as a national church, it seems to me. Third comment, I'm really thankful we adopted a strong networking, relational, organisational approach to what we're doing. All 7 of our churches connect together and pray together, financially support together, are committed to doing more planting and evangelistic and missional activity together. And I think that's a great strength, and under God hopefully will preserve health into the 2nd and 3rd generational phases of these churches. One illustration I remember was when one of our churches was struggling financially, all the senior pastors were together, and this pastor shared that the leadership of his church had decided they would need to reduce staff wages by 20% for a period until they could recover. But all the pastors at that time said, no, we don't, that's not the way we work. And we all take a hit because we're part of a network. And it seems to me that that was a great strength at that time of networking together with that gospel concern. Fourth comment, then I finish. People often ask me about the impact on the mother church. So the mother church has planted 4 churches since 2001 and sent out significant groups. It's now the same size as it was before we started planting. In fact, probably a tad bigger than what it was at that stage. But it is much healthier. Much, much healthier. New churches reach new people. It seems to me that sending churches are reminded of the great gospel need and task before them and keep that on the agenda as they press forward. Those of us in Adelaide and South Australia who are here for this conference, we would certainly appreciate your prayers as we partner together in the work of the gospel in that city. Pray that God in his kindness will give all the gospel churches there a really fruitful season of evangelism as we seek to honour his name. We really do covet your prayers. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Hasn't that been just a magnificent session with a great array of gospel entrepreneurship? Would you please thank Craig and Andrew and Lynda and Mark and Paul and Stephen for their contributions to us this afternoon.